The cardboard box scraped against the mahogany floor, producing a harsh, ugly sound in an office that usually smelled of lemon polish and expensive leather. I watched Marcus pack up his life. My son-in-law, our former chief strategy officer, was now a man without a title, without a company, and very soon, without a wife. His hands shook as he shoved a framed photograph of Hannah into the carton, and his grip slipped. The frame dropped, sending shattered glass over the rug. But neither of us moved to pick it up. My name is Donald Avery. Building this packaging empire took 45 of my 70 years, and experience taught me a long time ago that you never interrupt a man who is busy destroying himself. Marcus stared at the broken glass, breathing hard, finally realizing he had lost everything he had tried to steal. This quiet destruction actually began 5 weeks earlier, inside a ballroom filled with 500 people. We were supposed to be celebrating the company anniversary. The champagne flutes were still clinking when Marcus pointed a finger across the linen tablecloth, aiming right at my chest. He signaled 2 security guards and told them to escort me out. The music stopped abruptly. 500 heads turned toward table 1, and I felt the sudden chill of the air conditioning against the back of my neck. A security guard, a young kid in a uniform that looked a size too big for him, swallowed hard and stepped forward. He asked me to please come with him. Arguing would have given Marcus exactly what he wanted. I simply stood, pushed my chair in, and walked toward the coat check. Before turning away, I glanced at Hannah. My daughter sat perfectly still, her knuckles white against the stem of her wine glass, and she refused to meet my eyes. Marcus hovered behind her, resting his hands on her shoulders, playing the role of the concerned, protective husband. He needed a reaction. He needed me to yell, to throw a punch, to prove to every board member in that room that I was losing my mind. The attendant handed over my wool coat, and it felt heavier than usual as I slipped it on. Before I reached the double doors leading to the lobby, a chair scraped back from the executive table. Arthur, the chairman of our board, stood up. The older man ignored Marcus completely. Instead, he faced me, bowed his head slightly, and wished me a good evening, sir. That small gesture of respect echoed loudly in the silent room. As I walked through the empty lobby, my shoes clicking against the marble tiles, I stopped by the main presentation board. Glossy banners displayed a new corporate logo, a design I had never approved, wrapped around the word merger. The ink smelled sharp and fresh. Marcus had already ordered the promotional materials, meaning his plan was much further along than I had realized. A younger man might have marched back into that ballroom. He might have grabbed the microphone and reminded everyone who actually owned 51% of the voting shares. Anger, however, is a luxury you cannot afford when someone has set a trap for you. I pushed through the revolving doors into the cool night air. The valet brought my car around, and I drove away from my own anniversary party in complete silence. I parked in my driveway, turned off the engine, and just sat in the dark for a long time. The dashboard clock glowed faintly. Then, my phone vibrated against the center console. I picked it up, noting the caller ID in the corporate basement. I answered, and the night watchman's voice came through, quiet and rushed. He told me the archive room had exactly what I asked for. The engine of my sedan idled in the driveway for exactly 2 minutes before I shifted back into reverse. Driving downtown at midnight felt different than my usual morning commute. The city streets were completely empty, and the corporate headquarters loomed against the dark sky like a glass fortress. Stan, the night security supervisor, met me at the loading dock. The older man held a ring of brass keys and simply nodded, walking me past the silent elevators toward the basement stairwell. Dust hung thick in the archive room. The heavy steel door clicked shut behind us, and the smell of decaying paper and damp cardboard immediately filled my lungs. Stan pointed his flashlight toward aisle 7, row 4, box 42. He had pulled the corporate minute books and the original property index, just as I requested over the phone. I thanked him and pulled up a metal folding chair. The overhead fluorescent bulb buzzed, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. My fingers traced the edges of a heavy binder from 18 years ago. Back then, we were just trying to keep the lights on and the assembly lines moving. Now, that same binder held the only defense against a hostile takeover, disguised as a family celebration. Marcus thought my power rested entirely in my current title. My son-in-law fundamentally misunderstood how this company was built. He only looked at the surface, reading the modern shareholder agreements and the latest quarterly reports. The young executive never bothered to study the foundational charter. Flipping to page 84, I found the signatures. My own handwriting, much sharper back then, sat next to the county commissioner's seal. The sun was just coming up when I walked into a quiet diner on the edge of town. Robert sat in a corner booth, nursing a black coffee. He had served as our lead corporate counsel for 3 decades before retiring to play golf and spoil his grandchildren. The retired attorney looked up, sliding a thick manila envelope across the Formica table. I sat down and ordered tea, making sure to keep my voice low. Robert tapped the envelope with a sugar packet. He explained that he spent the early hours of the morning reviewing the copies I sent him, confirming that the community covenant was exactly where we left it 18 years ago. We had signed that agreement to secure tax incentives and zoning permits from the county, and in exchange, the company promised to maintain the original manufacturing plant to keep those local jobs intact. My old friend leaned closer, his eyes sharp. He reminded me of the specific mechanism we attached to that covenant. To satisfy the local government, we had embedded a permanent amendment into the corporate charter. The rule was absolute. If any proposed transaction threatened to permanently close the original factory, the founders' voting rights locked into place. Those voting rights could never be exercised by any proxy, substitute, or designated representative. Marcus wanted to push me out by claiming I was unfit, planning to hand my voting power to Hannah. But the moment his merger agenda included shutting down the original plant, his proxy strategy became completely useless. The covenant protected me from exactly this kind of theft. I took a slow sip of my tea. The warmth spread through my chest, chasing away the chill of the basement. Robert warned me that having the weapon was not enough, because I had to let Marcus spring the trap entirely before dropping the blade. If I showed my hand too early, the board would just vote to remove the factory closure from the deal and find another way to bleed me dry. The following Monday, the corporate offices buzzed with an aggressive, nervous energy. Marcus had ordered a massive push for the merger preparations. Moving boxes appeared outside the logistics department, and hushed conversations stopped whenever I walked past a cubicle. I went straight to my office and closed the door. David, our head of internal audit, slipped in a few minutes later. He was a careful, quiet accountant who had been with us for 15 years. I handed him a signed authorization form. The mandate was simple but strictly confidential, requiring a complete independent review of the financial forecasts Marcus was using to justify the merger to the board. David looked at the document, folded it neatly, and placed it in his breast pocket. He promised to keep the investigation entirely off the main servers. For the next 5 weeks, I played the part Marcus assigned to me. I sat quietly in executive meetings while my son-in-law dominated the conversation. He stood at the head of the conference table, wearing crisp custom suits, pointing at projection screens, and talking about modernizing our portfolio. Whenever he asked for my opinion, his tone dripped with that practiced, condescending patience people reserve for toddlers or the elderly. I just nodded. I let him build his kingdom of sand. Every time I stayed silent, Marcus grew bolder, entirely convinced that his public humiliation at the anniversary gala had broken my spirit. The illusion of victory is the most dangerous drug in the corporate world. Late on a Thursday afternoon, while the rest of the floor was emptying out for the day, a soft knock came at my door. David stepped inside and locked the deadbolt behind him. The auditor did not sit down. He walked straight to my desk and placed a single printed spreadsheet over my writing pad. His hands were remarkably steady for a man delivering a death sentence. David pointed to the third column, his voice barely above a whisper. He found the missing revenue projections. The numbers presented to the board had been systematically altered, stripping millions in projected growth from our current operations to make the merger look like our only chance for survival. The trap was finally starting to close. Hannah came over on a Sunday afternoon, bringing a bakery box of cherry pastries. The cardboard felt warm when she handed it to me, and the smell of toasted sugar usually made the house feel full. Today, the scent just seemed overly sweet and cloying. My daughter stood by the kitchen island, tracking my every movement as I poured the coffee. Her eyes darted from the ceramic mugs to the silver spoon, watching me with the nervous intensity of a sentry waiting for a perimeter breach. "You look tired, Dad," she said softly. "It has been a long month," I replied. I set the cups down on the granite counter and pushed one toward her. She stirred her coffee, the metal clinking against the rim in a rapid, uneven rhythm. I thought she was just worried about the upcoming board meeting, but her next question had nothing to do with corporate strategy or the factory. She asked if I remembered where I put the spare keys to the boathouse. I stopped, a sugar packet hovering over my mug. I closed my eyes for a second, searching my recent memory, but the location escaped me entirely. For a brief, terrifying moment, the accumulated fatigue of the last 5 weeks pressed down heavily on my chest, and I wondered if my mind really was slipping. At 70 years old, that specific fear always lingers in the background, waiting for a moment of weakness to strike. You put them in the hall drawer, Hannah filled in quickly. Her voice was tight, trembling slightly at the edges. Marcus mentioned you spent 20 minutes looking for them on Wednesday. He said, you seemed really confused. My jaw tightened, though I kept my expression perfectly blank. My son-in-law had taken a simple moment of distraction and twisted it into a medical symptom. I looked at my daughter, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the way her fingers gripped the edge of the counter until her knuckles turned white. She was not acting out of malice or greed. She honestly believed she was watching her father slowly fade away. I had a lot on my mind on Wednesday, I said, taking a slow sip of the hot coffee. Hannah shook her head, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders even though the kitchen was warm. She started listing other things. Small, insignificant details flowed from her mouth in a rushed whisper. A forgotten name of a landscaper. A misplaced file folder on my desk. A meeting time I had to ask my assistant to repeat. Every single incident had been quietly cataloged, magnified, and fed back to her by her husband. Marcus is just worried, she continued, looking down at the floor. He says you are carrying too much weight. He thinks the stress of the merger is accelerating things. Before I could formulate a response that would not reveal my hand, Hannah stepped away to fetch a napkin from the pantry. She left her phone resting face up next to her untouched pastry. Her phone lit up on the kitchen counter. I was not trying to read it, but the screen was facing me, and the bold calendar title was impossible to miss. Capacity Discussion. Before the display dimmed, another notification appeared beneath it, asking whether the proxy paperwork had been prepared before I could look away. It was a calendar alert scheduled for the following morning. The bold text read, Capacity Discussion, followed immediately by a direct message from Marcus. He was asking if she had the proxy authorization drafts ready for the lawyers. The final pieces of the puzzle locked into place, forming a picture far uglier than corporate greed. Every time I rubbed my temples during a long presentation, Marcus was there to point it out to my daughter. He was building a narrative of mental decline, brick by brick, using her genuine love as the mortar. My daughter was secretly passing along her harmless observations, completely unaware that the man she slept next to was weaponizing those details to strip away my legal authority. The word proxy echoed in my head long after the screen went dark. In corporate law, assigning a proxy means handing over your voting rights to another person. If Hannah were appointed to exercise my voting rights on my behalf, Marcus would not control my shares directly. He would control the person casting those votes. That was all he needed. My 51% would still be mine on paper, but the decision behind it would belong to him. He would walk into the boardroom wearing my authority like a stolen suit. He would push the merger through, close the original factory, and terminate hundreds of workers who had trusted my family for 3 generations. I did not confront her. I simply took a step back from the island and stared out the window at the empty driveway. Confrontation requires evidence, and forcing her to choose between her father and her husband right now would only push her further into his control. When Hannah returned with the napkins, she placed a warm hand on my forearm. The gesture felt heavy, with misplaced pity. Marcus just wants to help handle the heavy lifting, she whispered, her eyes pleading with me to understand. He thinks you should step back, just for a little while. Just until the merger is complete and the dust settles. If something happens during this transition, everyone could lose everything. And what do you think? I asked. I kept my voice perfectly level, hiding the cold anger settling deep in my stomach. She swallowed hard, blinking rapidly. I think you need rest, Marcus says. A temporary proxy would protect the family. It would protect your legacy, Dad. The manipulation was flawless. Marcus had successfully framed my destruction as an act of family preservation. He convinced a loving daughter that the only way to save her father was to take away his voice. She packed up her things shortly after that, hugging me goodbye at the front door. I smelled her floral perfume, the same scent her mother used to wear, mixed with the cold autumn air rushing in from the porch. She promised to call me the next morning before she went into the office. I stood by the front window, watching her taillights disappear down the quiet suburban street. The silence of the empty house rushed back in, but it no longer felt peaceful. The audit report sitting locked in my study drawer proved Marcus was lying to the board about the company finances. But that financial crime paled in comparison to this. He was actively preparing the legal documents to declare me incompetent. My son-in-law was handing the board a loaded gun, and he was using my own child to pull the trigger. Monday morning rain washed down the large bay window of my home office, blurring the manicured lawns into patches of dull green and gray. Drops hit the thick glass with a steady, rhythmic tapping that usually helped me think. Today, the sound just amplified the heavy silence in the room. I sat at my oak desk with the original corporate minute book spread open under the brass lamp. The yellowed pages smelled like old dust, dried binding glue, and the cheap coffee we used to drink when we were just trying to keep the lights on. Robert had pointed me to the right section during our diner meeting, but reading the actual legal text with my own eyes made the reality settle deep into my bones. 18 years ago, our company was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. We needed a massive tax break and zoning permits from the county to keep the assembly lines running. The local government agreed to give us those lifelines, and in return, they demanded a blood oath. They called it the Community Covenant. My index finger traced the faded ink of the signatures. The county commissioner had signed his name right below mine in thick blue ink. The agreement explicitly stated that the company would never abandon the original manufacturing plant. We promised to anchor those jobs in the community, providing a stable foundation for hundreds of families who relied on our factory floor. But a promise is just wind without legal enforcement. So we embedded that covenant directly into the corporate charter to satisfy the county lawyers. The text on page 42 of the minute book laid out the exact mechanism. It was a founder voting protection clause, and reading it now felt like discovering a buried treasure in my own backyard. The legal language was dense, filled with endless clauses and subclauses, yet the core meaning was absolutely clear. If any future board of directors proposed a transaction that would permanently close the original factory, a special condition activated immediately. Under that specific threat, the founder of the company retained absolute voting rights over their shares, and those rights could never be transferred. Those last few words were the most beautiful things I had ever read. They meant my 51% could never be voted by a proxy, a substitute, or a designated representative. The corporate charter legally blocked anyone from taking my voice on that specific issue. Marcus could manipulate my daughter into signing 1,000 proxy forms, and the board could demand an independent capacity review before allowing me to vote, but none of it would matter. The charter overrode any attempt to replace my own vote with a proxy once the covenant was triggered. I had the weapon, but a weapon only works if the enemy steps directly into the line of fire. I needed absolute confirmation from the one man who controlled the board agenda. Arthur suggested we meet at the Old Country Club on the north side of town. The dining room was completely empty at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. The faint clinking of silverware echoed from the kitchen, while rain continued to beat against the tall glass windows. Our chairman sat across from me in a leather booth, nursing a glass of sparkling water. He wore a gray, tailored suit and a look of deep, quiet concern. I slid a photocopy of the charter amendment across the polished mahogany table. Arthur picked it up, pulled his reading glasses from his breast pocket, and read the text slowly. The older man had been on the board for 2 decades, serving as a steady hand through multiple market crashes. He knew our history, and seeing the forgotten clause resurrected brought a sharp gleam to his eyes. Arthur folded the paper neatly and set it down next to his water glass. He confirmed that the amendment was completely valid and still legally binding. No one had ever repealed it because no one had ever attempted to close the original plant until now. The chairman looked around the empty room, lowering his voice to a whisper, and asked what I wanted to do with this information. I told him to do absolutely nothing. If we brought this to the corporate attorneys right now, Marcus would simply rewrite the merger terms. The young executive would carve the factory out of the deal just to keep his proxy strategy alive, and then he would find another way to destroy me later. I needed Marcus to commit his lies to the official record. I needed him to lock himself into a corner where his own arrogance would be his executioner. Arthur nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of the silent war we were fighting. He promised to keep the board completely blind to the covenant until the final vote was called. 3 days later, a courier dropped a heavy leather binder on my front porch. The package contained the official preparatory documents for the upcoming board meeting. Marcus had expedited the entire timeline, pushing the merger vote to the very top of the schedule. I carried the binder into my kitchen, poured a cup of black coffee, and sat down at the island to read through the pages. My pulse drummed a slow, heavy rhythm in my ears. The glossy sheets were filled with pie charts, synergy projections, and cost reduction rationales. My daughter's husband had painted a masterpiece of corporate restructuring. He promised the shareholders massive returns and unprecedented market expansion, but the true cost was buried deep on page 87. There it was, printed in bold black ink. Step 4 of the integration plan explicitly mandated the permanent closure and liquidation of the original manufacturing facility. Marcus had written the exact words necessary to activate the community covenant. He was planning to fire 700 loyal workers just to inflate his own acquisition bonus, treating their livelihoods as nothing more than a rounding error. A cold, sharp clarity settled over me as I closed the binder. Marcus thought he was clearing the final hurdle. He believed that by rushing the agenda and forcing my daughter to act as his pawn, he had outsmarted an old man. He had no idea that his own ambition had just sealed his fate. The merger did not just threaten my company anymore. It triggered the exact legal trap designed to protect it. The fluorescent lights hummed a low, steady pitch in the windowless sub-basement conference room, smelling faintly of ozone and stale floor wax. David, our head of internal audit, spread 3 distinct stacks of paper across the scratched laminate table. The accountant looked utterly exhausted, sporting dark circles under his eyes and a wrinkled collar, but his hands moved with absolute precision. We were in the 4th week of his covert investigation, and the sheer volume of deception my son-in-law had built required physical space to fully comprehend. David slid the first stack of documents toward my side of the table. The heavy paper contained 2 different versions of the 3rd quarter revenue projections. The auditor tapped the first page with his silver pen, explaining that he had recovered the original drafts from a backup server. Those authentic numbers showed steady, reliable growth for the original manufacturing plant. Then, David turned over the second page. This was the altered version Marcus had officially presented to the executive board. My son-in-law had systematically reassigned the factory's most profitable shipping contracts to a newer subsidiary on paper, artificially draining the original plant of its revenue. He created a financial crisis out of thin air just to justify shutting the doors and laying off 700 people. Next came the risk assessment memo. A private consulting firm from Chicago had warned our strategy department that liquidating the old facility would trigger massive severance payouts, alongside severe municipal tax penalties for breaking our local employment agreements. If the board approved the merger based on Marcus's glowing presentation, those hidden liabilities would bankrupt our operational budget within 6 months. David pointed to the date stamp at the top right corner of the page. Marcus received this devastating warning 2 months ago. Instead of disclosing the risks to the board, he buried the memo in a restricted digital folder and ordered his team to draft a revised report that completely omitted the financial penalties. He was not just maneuvering for power anymore, he was actively defrauding the shareholders to guarantee his own massive acquisition bonus before the ship went down. The financial crimes alone were more than enough to terminate a chief strategy officer for cause. But the final stack of papers David pushed across the table revealed something far more dangerous than simple corporate greed. I picked up a printed email chain originating from our public relations director. Marcus had sent the initial message exactly 10 days before the anniversary gala. The subject line read, "Confidential Corporate Restructuring," and reading the body of the text felt like stepping onto a frozen lake and hearing the ice crack under my boots. Marcus explicitly instructed the media team to prepare for a sudden, unexpected shift in executive authority. He told them to build a narrative citing unfortunate health concerns regarding the founder. Attached to that email chain was a draft press release, and David handed me a clean copy to read. The bold headline praised my decades of dedicated service, wishing me a peaceful and comfortable retirement, while seamlessly announcing Marcus as the interim voting authority to guide the upcoming merger. A highlighted section near the bottom included a placeholder for a prepared quote from an unnamed family member, expressing deep sorrow over my rapid mental decline. My teeth ground together so hard my jaw began to ache. I placed the paper flat on the table, carefully smoothing the curled edges with my thumb. He was going to put those fabricated words right into my daughter's mouth. Every single aspect of my supposed dementia had been scripted, polished, and spell-checked by a corporate communications team before I ever put on my suit for that anniversary party. The security guards who escorted me out, the perfectly timed whispers in the crowd, the calculated concern he fed to Hannah every night in their kitchen, it was all a stage play designed to launch a pre-written press release. Marcus thought he was brilliant, spinning a complex web of modern corporate strategy and fake family concern. Yet he left a digital trail a mile wide. He assumed his executive title granted him total invisibility, completely forgetting that men like David operated outside the normal reporting structure. Checking the deleted server logs took the quiet accountant less than an hour. I thanked David, keeping my voice steady despite the cold fury settling deep in my chest. I instructed him to compile every single email, altered forecast, and hidden memo into a certified audit report, and to print 3 hard copies. We could not trust digital files that could be erased remotely or shared drives that Marcus could monitor. We needed physical paper, bound and stamped, ready to be dropped on a mahogany table. The accountant nodded silently, gathering the original documents back into his worn leather briefcase. He promised to have the final binders assembled by the end of the week, then slipped out of the room, leaving me alone with the buzzing fluorescent lights. I sat there for a long time, listening to the faint hum of the ventilation system, calculating the exact sequence of events required to spring the trap. I had the community covenant to protect my voting rights, and I had the audit to destroy his career. But timing was everything. My phone vibrated against the hard table, shattering the quiet atmosphere. The screen illuminated with a priority calendar notification sent to all executive directors. Arthur had officially scheduled a special board meeting for 8 o'clock Friday morning. Marcus was finally forcing the vote, rushing to claim his prize, completely unaware that he had just scheduled his own corporate execution. Stan, the night security supervisor, owed me a favor from 20 years ago. I called that favor in late Wednesday night. The older man drove to my house in the pouring rain, walked up the driveway, and handed over a thick manila envelope containing a secure corporate tablet. He did not ask any questions. The veteran guard just nodded once, pulled his yellow raincoat tight against the wind, and walked back to his truck. I sat at my oak desk and pressed the power button. The screen glowed to life, illuminating the dark office, and I opened the unedited security footage from the anniversary gala. The primary camera angle looked down from the ballroom ceiling, capturing the moments right before I was escorted out of the building. Marcus stood near the kitchen doors holding a champagne flute, waving a young security guard over to his side. I turned the volume up to maximum. The audio was heavily muffled by the jazz band playing in the background, but my daughter's husband leaned close to the guard's lapel microphone. His voice cut through the music with absolute chilling precision. "Keep pushing him," Marcus said, pointing directly at my table. "Make sure everyone sees it. If he resists, call for backup." He was not reacting to a sudden disruption. The executive had orchestrated the entire scene, directing the guards like actors on a stage to guarantee my public humiliation. I watched the video 3 times, letting the cold reality of his calculations sink into my bones. On Thursday afternoon, David arrived at my house through the back door. The head of internal audit carried a heavy cardboard box, setting it gently on my kitchen island. Inside sat 3 identical leather binders. 5 weeks of painstaking forensic accounting were perfectly tabbed, indexed, and cross-referenced. David opened the top binder and flipped to a section marked with a bright red sticky note. He had pulled the corporate phone records from the executive suite, printing the text logs in stark black and white. The pages detailed conversations between Marcus and the public relations director on the night of the gala. "Are the cameras rolling?" Marcus had typed at 8:15. "Ready on your signal?" the director replied. Another message thread, sent 3 weeks earlier, showed Marcus coordinating with the Human Resources Department. He explicitly ordered them to quietly prepare 700 severance packages for the original factory workers, proving he intended to close the plant long before he even presented the merger proposal to the board. Every single escape route Marcus could possibly use was now firmly sealed. He could not claim the incident at the party was a misunderstanding, and he certainly could not defend the altered financial forecasts. The audit proved he manipulated the corporate numbers, while the texts and video proved he manufactured a crisis regarding my mental health. Just as David was pulling out of the driveway, headlights swept across my front window. Hannah parked her SUV and walked up the front steps carrying a covered casserole dish. I quickly locked the audit binders inside my office safe before walking down the hall to open the front door. My daughter stepped inside, brushing the cold autumn rain from her wool coat. Something about her posture had shifted drastically since our last conversation. She normally filled the house with nervous energy, constantly asking about my diet or my sleep schedule, but tonight she was incredibly quiet. The smell of roasted chicken and rosemary filled the entryway, offering a warm contrast to the freezing tension radiating from her shoulders. Hannah set the glass dish on the stove, standing there for a long time, just tracing the edge of the counter with her index finger. "The special board meeting is tomorrow morning," Hannah finally said. Her voice sounded completely hollow, stripped of its usual warmth and cadence. 8 o'clock, I replied, watching her carefully. She did not mention the proxy paperwork. She did not bring up my memory lapses or her husband's concerns about my health. Instead, my daughter simply looked at me, her eyes red, rimmed, and deeply shadowed. She held her cell phone tightly in her left hand, her thumb resting on the dark screen, gripping the plastic case so hard her knuckles were completely white. I had no idea what she was thinking. I could only observe the heavy, suffocating silence hanging between us. She looked like someone who had just woken up in an unfamiliar room, completely disoriented and terrified to make a sudden movement. "Dad," she started, her voice catching in her throat. She looked down at her phone, then back up at me, blinking rapidly. "Will you be all right tomorrow?" "I will be exactly where I need to be," I told her. Hannah nodded once, a sharp and jerky motion. She wrapped her arms around my neck, hugging me much tighter than usual, burying her face in my shoulder for a brief second. Then she pulled away, grabbed her keys, and walked out into the rain without saying another word. I barely slept that night. The house remained completely silent, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I sat in my leather armchair in the dark, drinking cold coffee, running through the sequence of events over and over in my mind. Marcus would try to control the room tomorrow. He would lean on his polished presentation skills, absolutely confident that he held all the right cards. He still believed I was arriving at that meeting to fight for my dignity. He had no idea I was coming to burn his kingdom to the ground. At 6 in the morning, I showered, shaved, and put on my dark navy suit. The thick wool felt like armor. I packed the 3 heavy audit binders into my leather briefcase, snapped the brass locks shut, and walked out to my car. The morning air was crisp and completely clear, the storm having passed during the night. I drove downtown as the city woke up, watching the sun reflect off the glass panels of the corporate tower. I pulled into my reserved parking space, gripped the handle of my briefcase, and walked toward the private elevator. The digital display counted up to the executive floor. The doors slid open with a soft chime, and I stepped out onto the thick carpet. The boardroom awaited at the end of the hall, where the board of directors was already gathering for the execution. 12 leather chairs surrounded the massive mahogany table in the executive boardroom. I took my usual seat near the tall glass window, watching the remaining directors filter into the room and open their morning coffee cups. Marcus stood near the digital projector at the far end, wearing a custom charcoal suit and projecting absolute confidence. He chatted quietly with the head of human resources, offering a practiced, sorrowful smile that made my stomach turn. Hannah sat a few chairs away from him. She kept her eyes fixed firmly on her blank legal pad, entirely motionless. Arthur cleared his throat, bringing the room to order as the heavy wooden doors clicked shut. Our chairman did not bother with the usual pleasantries or financial updates. He simply stated that a special motion had been brought forward regarding executive voting authority, and he yielded the floor. Marcus buttoned his suit jacket and stepped to the center of the room. He spoke with a soft, measured cadence, sounding exactly like a man burdened by a tragic family duty. He talked about my decades of service, the incredible legacy of the original factory, and the painful realities of aging. Then he placed a stack of proxy authorization forms on the polished wood. He formally requested that the board temporarily suspend my voting authority pending an independent capacity review, after which Hannah would serve as my court-recognized temporary voting representative if legally approved, citing documented memory lapses that allegedly threatened the merger process. A heavy silence fell over the room. 2 board members looked down at their hands, clearly uncomfortable with the public humiliation of their founder, while a few others nodded in quiet sympathy. I did not raise my voice. I simply unlatched my leather briefcase, the brass locks snapping loudly in the quiet space, and pulled out a small silver flash drive. I handed it to Arthur and asked him to play the only video file on the drive. The projector hummed, casting a bright rectangle against the far wall. The overhead security footage from our anniversary gala filled the screen. There was no audio at first, just the silent image of 500 guests drinking champagne under crystal chandeliers. Then the camera zoomed in on the kitchen doors. Marcus appeared on screen, waving a young security guard over to his side. I had asked our tech department to isolate the audio from the lapel microphones, and the sound suddenly crackled through the ceiling speakers. The jazz band played faintly in the background, but Marcus spoke with chilling clarity. He ordered the guard to keep pushing me, demanding that they make sure everyone saw the confrontation. The recording captured him explicitly planning a physical escalation if I refused to leave. A collective gasp rippled around the table. The woman from Human Resources dropped her pen, staring at the screen in absolute horror. Marcus froze, his practice mask slipping for the very first time, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. Before he could formulate an excuse about a misunderstanding, I pulled the first stack of printed emails from my briefcase and slid them down the long table. I told the directors to look at the date stamps. The papers rustled as 12 people flipped through the confidential messages. They saw a printed calendar invitation for a medical capacity discussion, scheduled 3 full weeks before the gala. Then they read the exact words Marcus had sent to our public relations director 10 days before the anniversary party. He had ordered them to prepare for a sudden shift in executive authority due to my declining health. The next page contained the draft press release, completely pre-written and ready to publish, featuring a fabricated quote from an unnamed family member expressing sorrow over my mental state. I looked directly at Marcus, leaning forward and resting my forearms on the cool wood. I told the room that the young executive did not react to a spontaneous health crisis. He wrote a script, hired security guards to help me act it out, and scheduled the press release before I ever put on my tuxedo. His face flushed a dark, angry crimson. He slammed his hand against the table, insisting that his methods might have been aggressive, but his intentions were purely to save the company from my outdated leadership. He pointed at the merger branding on his presentation folders, claiming he was protecting shareholder value. That was the exact moment I dropped the 3 heavy leather audit binders onto the mahogany surface. The solid thud echoed like a gavel striking a block. I opened the top binder and read the findings from our internal audit division out loud. I walked the board through the 2 sets of financial projections, showing how Marcus had deliberately reassigned the factory's most profitable shipping contracts on paper to create a fake revenue crisis. Then, I revealed the hidden risk assessment from the Chicago consulting firm. The memo explicitly warned that liquidating the old facility would trigger massive municipal tax penalties, bankrupting our operational budget within 6 months. The board members began speaking over each other, their voices rising in panic and outrage. Arthur slapped his palm flat against the table, demanding immediate silence. The chairman glared at Marcus with absolute disgust, asking if he truly intended to defraud the investors just to secure an acquisition bonus before the severance payouts ruined us. The walls were closing in, and every single escape route had been systematically sealed. Marcus looked around the room, realizing that his executive title, his custom suit, and his corporate vocabulary could no longer protect him. His grand strategy had collapsed into a pile of undeniable documentary evidence. Desperation is an ugly thing to witness in a man who thinks he is untouchable. Breathing heavily, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead, Marcus spun away from the board and turned his attention to the only person in the room he thought he still controlled. He stepped toward Hannah, gripping the back of her leather chair with both hands. His voice shook with a mixture of terror and rage. He ordered his wife to tell the board about the lost keys, the misplaced files, and the memory lapses. He demanded that she open her mouth and tell everyone exactly how sick her father really was. Marcus leaned heavily against the back of Hannah's chair, his knuckles white against the dark leather. His breathing was shallow and rapid, echoing loudly in the completely silent boardroom. He had just spent 5 weeks carefully building a narrative of family concern, portraying himself as a devoted husband protecting a failing father. Now, with the security footage and the audit report resting on the table, that mask had been violently ripped away. He was desperate to pull it back on. "Tell them he's sick, Hannah," Marcus ordered, his voice cracking slightly. "Tell them about the pills. Tell them how he forgot where the spare keys were on Wednesday." My daughter did not move. She remained perfectly still, staring blankly at the polished mahogany table in front of her. "Tell them!" he shouted, slapping the leather headrest. "He is confused. He is exhausted. You told me yourself that he can barely keep track of his own schedule anymore. Explain to the board why you need to sign the proxy." Every director in the room was watching her. Arthur folded his hands, his expression utterly unreadable, while the woman from Human Resources looked away, clearly uncomfortable with a husband screaming at his wife in a professional setting. I stayed in my seat, keeping my hands flat on the table. The urge to stand up and physically remove him from the room was overwhelming, but I knew I had to let this play out. Hannah had to see him clearly, without the filter of his smooth corporate charm. Marcus shook her chair slightly, his voice dropping into that quiet, condescending tone he usually saved for difficult employees. He told her she was the only one who could save the company now. He insisted they were doing this out of love, to protect my legacy before I accidentally destroyed it. Hannah finally looked up. She did not look at the board members, and she did not look at me. She turned her head slowly, staring directly at her husband's pale, sweating face. Her expression was completely devoid of anger or sadness. It was just empty, like she was looking at a total stranger, standing in her living room. She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. The heavy plastic case clicked softly against the wood as she set it down. Hannah tapped the screen, unlocking the device, and pushed it exactly into the center of the table, right under the bright glare of the overhead lights. She did not raise her voice. She spoke with a quiet, hollow clarity that cut through the tension in the room like a scalpel. "Read the messages," Hannah instructed the board. Arthur leaned forward, picking up the device carefully. He adjusted his reading glasses and scrolled through the screen. His jaw tightened instantly. The chairman cleared his throat, reading the text exchange out loud for the official record. "You wrote to your wife on the 12th, Arthur read, his voice heavy with disgust. "You said, 'Did he forget the name of the landscaper again? Make a note of the date. We will need it later.'" The chairman scrolled down further, reading another message sent just 2 days ago. "Don't let him convince you he is fine. He is slipping. If you don't take the proxy, the board will just fire him publicly. You have to force him to step down for his own good." Marcus stepped back from the chair, holding his hands up defensively. He stammered, claiming the texts were taken entirely out of context. He tried to argue that private family conversations had no place in a corporate governance meeting, but his words just hung in the dead air. Nobody was listening to him anymore. Hannah stood up, smoothing the front of her skirt. She finally looked at me, and I saw the deep, crushing exhaustion in her eyes. The realization that she had been used as a weapon against her own father had aged her 10 years in a single night. "I was worried about you," Hannah said, her voice wavering for the first time. "I thought I was helping. I shared those little moments of forgetfulness because I trusted my husband when he said he wanted to lighten your load." She turned back to Marcus, and whatever warmth she still held for him vanished completely. She told the room that she never authorized the draft press release. She never knew about the security guard at the gala, and she absolutely refused to sign any proxy paperwork. She stated for the official record that my mind was perfectly sound, and that any suggestion to the contrary was a deliberate fabrication created by the chief strategy officer. Then, my daughter picked up her purse, turned her back on her husband of 14 years, and walked out of the boardroom without looking back. The heavy wooden doors clicked shut behind her, sounding incredibly loud in the silent room. Marcus stood alone at the end of the table. His primary strategy was dead, his reputation was completely destroyed, and his marriage was over. However, the raw ambition of a corporate shark rarely dies quietly. He straightened his tie, forced a stiff posture, and looked directly at Arthur. He pointed at the merger branding on the projector screen. He argued that despite his personal mistakes, the financial logic of the acquisition was still undeniably sound. He insisted that the board still had a fiduciary duty to vote on the merger today. He claimed that because I was clearly biased and emotionally compromised, the board should invoke the emergency bylaws to override my 51% entirely and force the deal through. It was a desperate, flailing move, built entirely on corporate technicalities. He thought he could still bypass my authority if he just shouted loud enough about shareholder value. I stood up slowly, buttoning my suit jacket. I reached into my briefcase one last time, pulling out a single, yellow document encased in a protective plastic sleeve. I held the 18-year-old community covenant in my right hand, ready to show Marcus exactly why the founder always gets the final word. The plastic sleeve crinkled softly as I laid the yellowed document on the polished mahogany table. Arthur stood up, walking around the long table to stand beside me. The chairman reached into his jacket, pulled out the official corporate charter, and opened it to the page he had marked with a heavy paperclip. I did not need to read the words aloud because Arthur did it for me, and his deep voice carried the weight of absolute legal authority. Under the terms of the community covenant ratified 18 years ago and permanently attached to our charter, Arthur read, "Any proposed transaction resulting in the closure of the original manufacturing facility triggers a mandatory voting lock." He looked up, scanning the faces of the silent directors. Every single person in the room was listening now. "When this clause is triggered," Arthur continued, carefully emphasizing each word, "the founder's voting rights cannot be delegated, suspended, frozen, or exercised through any proxy, substitute, or representative. The founder alone must personally cast the votes attached to those shares." Marcus stared at the document, his mouth slightly open. His carefully constructed emergency motion, his desperate attempt to use corporate bylaws to strip my authority, was completely dead. He had spent weeks studying the modern shareholder agreements, meticulously searching for a loophole to steal my voice. He simply never bothered to read the foundational documents that actually built the company he was trying to sell. "Your motion for a proxy is legally invalid," I told him, keeping my voice low and steady. "And the merger you proposed directly violates the covenant that protects this company. Therefore, I am exercising my 51%. I looked at Arthur, nodding once. "For 5 weeks, you fought to take away my voice. Today, The charter gives it back to the only person who ever earned it. I cast every one of my 51% against this merger. My vote is no. I said. The silence that followed was absolute. The massive, multi-million-dollar merger, the grand strategy that Marcus had lied and manipulated to secure, evaporated in less than 3 seconds. He had built an elaborate trap, convinced my daughter to help him set the bait, and stood right in the center of it when the jaws snapped shut. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking hollow and incredibly small in his expensive charcoal suit. He reached out, his fingers brushing the edge of the audit report, but there was nothing left for him to say. He could not argue with the charter, he could not hide the financial fraud, and he could not rely on the wife he had publicly abused. Arthur walked back to the head of the table and took his seat. The chairman did not ask for further discussion. He did not offer Marcus a chance to defend himself or resign gracefully. Given the evidence of gross financial manipulation, deliberate misrepresentation of risk, and the orchestrated attempt to defraud the board of directors, Arthur stated, his tone completely clinical, I move for the immediate termination of the chief strategy officer for cause. A woman near the window seconded the motion instantly. The vote was unanimous. No one looked at Marcus as the final tally was recorded. The human resources director silently pulled a severance denial form from her leather portfolio, confirming that termination for cause instantly revoked his unvested stock options and any negotiated exit packages. He was walking out of the building with exactly what he had brought into it, nothing. I watched him pack up his office an hour later. The cardboard box scraped against the mahogany floor, producing that harsh, ugly sound. Marcus shoved his frame degrees and expensive desk accessories into the carton, his hands trembling violently. When he dropped the photograph of Hannah, shattering the glass across the rug, he finally stopped moving. He stared at the broken pieces, breathing hard, the reality of his complete destruction settling in. You spent months trying to convince everyone I was no longer fit to lead, I said quietly, leaning against the doorframe. Marcus slowly lifted his head, his eyes burning with a mixture of hatred and absolute defeat. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to offer one final insult, or to threaten a lawsuit he could never afford, but no words came out. Today you proved something very different, I told him, pushing away from the frame and walking out into the hallway. You were never fit to follow. I left him standing alone in the ruined office, surrounded by broken glass and empty ambitions. The quiet destruction was complete. I walked toward the elevator, the heavy burden of the last 5 weeks finally lifting from my shoulders, and pressed the button for the lobby. It was time to go home. 12 months pass. The rhythmic thumping of the corrugated cardboard presses echoed through the original manufacturing plant. A deep, mechanical heartbeat that you could feel right through the concrete floor. I stood on the cold steel catwalk overlooking the main assembly line. The air smelled of hot adhesive, machine oil, and fresh pine pulp, exactly the way it had for 4 decades. Below me, 3 new conveyor belts were moving at full capacity. Forklifts beeped in the distance, carrying massive rolls of recycled paper toward the loading dock. We had launched a major expansion project during the spring, using the exact capital Marcus had tried to liquidate. Sarah walked up the grated steel stairs, her boots clanking loudly against the metal. She wore a bright yellow hard hat and a practical canvas jacket over her tailored blazer. 20 years ago, the young woman started on this exact floor checking pallet weights, working the graveyard shift to pay for night school. Today, after serving as interim chief executive during the transition and unanimously earning the board's confidence, she officially held the title of Chief Executive Officer. The new leader leaned against the railing, pointing down at the newly installed logistics hub. Her voice carried the quiet, absolute authority of someone who actually knew how to fix a jammed roller, rather than someone who merely looked at spreadsheets in a corner office. She explained the updated shipping schedules, effortlessly reciting the new vendor contracts from memory. I nodded, listening to her breakdown, realizing I had not needed to correct a single decision she made in 6 months. The contrast between Sarah's solid leadership and the disaster we narrowly avoided felt sharper every day. Yesterday, Arthur had called my private line to share the latest update from the federal courthouse. The Securities and Exchange Commission formally upgraded their civil inquiry into a full investigation regarding corporate fraud. Marcus was currently spending his days sitting in sterile deposition rooms under oath. The disgraced executive was trying to explain his fabricated risk assessments to federal prosecutors, completely stripped of his corporate protections. He no longer wore custom suits. His legal bills were reportedly devouring whatever savings he had left, especially since Hannah finalized the divorce proceedings in early October. My daughter was slowly finding her way back to herself. We had dinner together every Sunday evening now, a quiet tradition we resurrected after the dust settled. She sold the massive suburban house she shared with her former husband, leaving all the expensive, modern furniture behind. Instead, she bought a smaller, sunlit place closer to the city, filling the living room with potted ferns and stacks of design books. Hannah still carried the weight of what happened. She occasionally fell silent when certain corporate topics came up, but she no longer flinched when her phone vibrated on the table. The hollow, terrified look was completely gone from her eyes. She was finally breathing her own air. I turned away from the catwalk, following Sarah back to the executive suite. My corner office looked completely different. The heavy mahogany desk was clear, and the built-in bookshelves sat mostly empty. I had spent the last 2 weeks packing up my personal files, leaving the heavy lifting of the corporate transition behind me. Arthur and the rest of the board had thrown a small, respectful dinner for me the previous night. There were no champagne flutes, no hidden agendas, and no hired security guards. We just shared good steaks and honest handshakes. Sarah stopped at the door to her new office, holding a thick stack of production manifests. She paused, tapping the folders against her palm. She asked if I wanted to review the quarterly numbers one last time before I drove home. I looked at the heavy documents in her hands, then looked at the confident, steady set of her shoulders. I told her the numbers were entirely hers to manage now. She smiled, a genuine expression of mutual respect, and thanked me before stepping inside to get to work. I picked up my old leather briefcase from the visitor chair. It felt incredibly light. I walked down the carpeted hallway, passing the boardroom where a young executive had once tried to strip away my dignity. The heavy wooden doors were propped open, catching the afternoon sunlight streaming through the large windows. The space no longer felt like a battlefield. It was just a room with a long table, waiting for the next generation of leaders to make their decisions. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. I stepped inside, pressing the button for the ground floor lobby. For most of my life, I believed that holding on to power was the only way to keep my family and my employees safe. I thought my grip on the steering wheel was the only thing keeping the company on the road. My former son-in-law taught me a very painful lesson about the illusion of absolute control. The young man chased authority so blindly that he destroyed his own life trying to steal mine. He wanted the title, the wealth, and the prestige, but he never understood the heavy responsibility that came with the corner office. He viewed people as numbers to be erased. The steel cables hummed quietly as the elevator carried me down. True leadership is never measured by how long you can grip the throne, or how many proxy votes you can manipulate in a dark room. It is measured entirely by the strength of the foundation you leave behind. The original factory was expanding, bringing new life into the community. Hundreds of local families had secure paychecks, and my daughter was free from a man who only saw her as a disposable tool. I walked across the marble lobby, pushed through the revolving glass doors, and stepped out into the bright afternoon sun. The company no longer needed me, and that was the greatest victory I could ever ask for. When you spend your entire adult life building a legacy from the ground up, you often convince yourself that you are the only person capable of protecting it. You pour your sweat, your sleepless nights, and your unwavering dedication into a foundation, believing that your constant presence is the only thing keeping the walls from caving in. Donald Avery believed that myth for 40 years, wearing his corporate responsibilities like a heavy suit of armor. However, the hardest lesson you will ever have to learn about leadership, power, and family is that true strength does not come from gripping the steering wheel until your knuckles turn white. Real authority is measured by your ultimate willingness to let go, and by the unshakable integrity of the people you carefully choose to leave behind. Marcus Reed chased authority with the kind of blind, consuming ambition that inevitably destroys everything it touches. He viewed empathy as a weakness and loyalty as a disposable tool for manipulation, completely failing to understand that a corporate title or a corner office can never grant you genuine respect. When you manipulate the people who love you, twisting their genuine concern into a weapon to use against their own family members, you are not building a sustainable empire. You are simply digging a very deep, very lonely grave. The tragedy of deep family betrayal is that it rarely comes from aggressive strangers breaking through your front door. It usually comes from the people sitting right next to you at the holiday dinner table, smiling warmly while they quietly weaponize your deepest fears about aging and relevance. You must learn to recognize the critical difference between someone who genuinely wants to help you carry your heavy burdens and someone who merely wants to steal your keys while you are distracted. Furthermore, You cannot protect your grown children from the painful realities of the world by continuously shielding them from the harsh truth. Donald had to endure the excruciating process of allowing his daughter to see the absolute worst of the man she married. He had to stand back in that silent boardroom and let the brutal reality of the betrayal wash over her entirely on her own. Rescuing Hannah from that uncomfortable truth, before she recognized it herself, would have only left her vulnerable to a lifetime of insidious manipulation. Sometimes the most profound act of parental love is letting a broken system collapse so your child can finally see the rot hidden deep inside the walls. Hannah lost a husband, but she successfully regained her autonomy and her clear voice. She learned the terrifying lesson that a marriage built on a foundation of orchestrated panic is nothing more than a hostage situation dressed up in expensive suits. Ultimately, a lasting legacy is not a lucrative stock portfolio or a family name proudly printed on the side of a massive concrete building. It is the solid community of hardworking people who can safely feed their families because you made ethical choices when nobody was watching. It is the profound ability to walk away from the height of your power, knowing that the structure will not violently collapse the moment you step out the door. When the dust settles and the boardrooms empty out for the evening, you are left with nothing but your fundamental character and the undeniable truth of exactly how you treated others. Have you ever found yourself holding on to a difficult situation, an exhausting relationship, or a familiar position of power long past the point of its expiration date simply because you were terrified of what might happen if you finally walked away? When we eventually find the profound courage to release our tight grip, we often discover that the things truly meant to survive will stand perfectly well on their own, without our constant intervention.